One of the most awkward holdovers from the new atheism era is the concept of Jesus mythicism, in which the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth is contested. So today we're going to look at the other claims, myths regarding the other deities, and seeing if this really holds up when we look at history or not. So to start out, what is Jesus mythicism? The origin appears to be during the French Enlightenment, but later, 19th century German philosopher Bruno Bauer published A Critique of the Gospels and History of Their Origin in 1850, about 1851, and later Christ and the Caesars in 1877. While these sparked controversy, you probably haven't heard much on these names unless you're into this kind of thing, because they were widely rejected, even by the much smaller but still present secular scholarship at that time. So the standard used really isn't a standard at all. It is hyper-skepticism designed, like disguised as genuine dialogue. And it ranges from I want non-Christian accounts from before the crucifixion to, well, if it's not written by Jesus himself, I'm not even listening. Four common criteria for Jesus mythicism present as follows: insider source exclusion fallacy, where non Christian sources are only admissible; the immediate non-partisan attestation standard, so it has to be a contemporary account not only by a non Christian, but by a neutral party altogether; the archetypal reductionism, seeing if the Jesus story borrows from other religions; and the contamination fallacy, so if it has any kind of supernatural or miraculous claims, you throw it out. Contemporary attestation is a problem. We live in a very, very privileged age where everyone's hot takes are on display in real time and other people talk about them. If you've ever been on Twitter, you know. Those are contemporary accounts, albeit pretty casual if we're talking about someone's political stances. Demanding contemporary accounts for everyone just doesn't work when we look at ancient history like this. Why? Well, if we use textual contemporary attestation for everyone, we'd need to throw out quite a bit of history. If you want to use this standard, then both apologists and secular scholarship has to say two things. One, by those standards, the historical existence of Jesus, yeah, it would be in contention because you couldn't prove it, but also you couldn't prove most people in antiquity by these standards either. So let's look at a few secular scholars to find out why. Bart D. Ehrman, prolific agnostic New Testament scholar who has published extensive work on the historicity of Jesus. His book, Did Jesus Exist, in 2012, assessed mythicism claims and flat out tells readers that mythicism looks foolish. Michael Grant, secular classicist and historian, wrote A Historian's Review of the Gospels in 1977 and stated that critical methods annihilate mythicism. Gerd Luderman, another atheist professor of New Testament studies, wrote The Resurrection of Jesus in 1995, and in it claimed that Jesus' execution by crucifixion was indisputable. There are dozens more, and an impressive amount of Christian scholars have made strides against mythicism as well, most notably Dr. Gary Habermas of Liberty University in his minimal facts approach. In it, that, if we boil it down pretty much to the standard basics, that an itinerant first century Jewish rabbi of Nazareth existed, was baptized by John the Baptist, and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And his disciples, some of whom initially didn't follow Jesus, claimed to see him risen from the dead. So the idea that the majority of scholars across the board agree with most of these points, and thus we build a multifaceted case for Jesus, is widely attested in scholarship, even if people like to pretend it's not. So, if the secular historians reject this, even not just the Christian historians, why do internet mythicists hold on to it? Well, it's because they treat Jesus like an exception to how ancient history is actually studied. So, we'll give this method the benefit of the doubt, and we'll look at some widely known figures in history and see what happens when you apply this same standard. First up, we're going to look at Alexander the Great, famous conqueror, military genius, and pseudo-architect of cities like Alexandria, and even Alexandria, not to be confused with Alexandria or the city he named after his favorite horse, Bucephala. He was one of the most well-known warrior kings in human history, sweeping from Greece to India, and he pivoted the trajectory of the ancient world. Here's the problem, though. Alexander was accompanied by court historians during his conquests in Asia, but every single contemporary account written down during his lifetime or immediately after his death has been lost. Yes, we do have coins, but there is not a single textual account from his life or right after. The earliest ones we have are from Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus, and were written anywhere from 300, that's being generous, to 450 years after his death. So a source gap like this of 300 to 450 years far exceeds the 20 to 60 year gap scholars usually agree on when looking at the Gospels or the Pauline epistles. Furthermore, stories about Alexander consistently weave in these divine birth narratives, like claiming he was the literal son of Zeus Amon, supernatural phenomena, and heroic parallels to Achilles. When we apply mythicist logic, it requires us to reclassify Alexander the Great as both allegorical sun god myth and or a Hellenistic political propaganda designed to legitimize the rule of the rival Diadochi's successor kingdoms. But he's unanimously attested to in the record. So, sure, let's keep going. Attila the Hun. Attila was the ruler of the Huns and brutal warlord of a tribal empire that devastated the Eastern and Western Roman empires during the 5th century CE. The Huns maintained no written language and produced zero native written records. Let me emphasize, there was no native written language or record. Looking elsewhere, we see Jordanes, a Gothic historian writing in the mid 6th century, who composed his account more than a century after Attila's death while incorporating popular legend and Germanic folklore. That is the main source we get information from on Attila the Hun. We do have a primary contemporary account for Attila, and that's from Priscus of Panium. So Panium wrote about Attila after he met and ate dinner with him. However, he was still an outsider and a Roman diplomat, which still violates more of the criteria. There are no native Hunnish documents, decrees, or inscriptions confirming he existed at all. Surviving reports come from ideological enemies like Roman and Christian historians, who cast him in theological terms like the apocalyptic scourge of God. Under hyper-skeptical standards, Attila the Hun would be rejected as a myth designed by late Roman Christian polemicists to explain the collapse of imperial border security and encourage more reform. Even though there is contemporary accounts about him, that would not be good enough for the mythicist standards, because that's just one of the 4 biggest criteria leveled against the historical Jesus. Historians reject this view because they know how to work with ideological sources, those with a political bias. If not, he would become a literal Christian boogeyman. Genghis Khan, the man who conquered more contiguous land than any human in history and built an empire that stretched from the Sea of Japan all the way to Central Europe. With a body count estimated to be over 40 million people, his military campaign crippled Europe and Asia. He not only built an empire, but he also fathered so many children that genetic studies suggest that roughly 8% of men living in the regions of the former Mongol Empire carry his genetic Y chromosomes, and about 0.5% of men worldwide carry them. However, just like Alexander and Attila, there is not a single surviving contemporary document written by Genghis Khan during his lifetime. The Secret History of the Mongols was compiled anonymously years after his death and opens explicitly with mythical claims, asserting his lineage descends from a divine wolf and a deer, and that he was born holding a clot of blood in his hand. Sure. Every other major biography comes from Persian, Chinese, and European chroniclers, direct military enemies who painted him as an apocalyptic plague sent by heaven to punish sinners. Under the hyper-skeptical standards, you can see where this is going. He's a myth, a plague to bring reckoning. If the name Khan is ringing any extra bells for anyone in the gaming community here, that is because the Mongolian invasion of Japan was the focus of the award-winning game Ghost of Tsushima, praised for its extreme attention to historical detail when weaving its own fictional story of Khotan Khan, a fictional grandson of Genghis Khan instead of his real grandson Kublai Khan, the one behind the real invasion. Yes, that's right. By Jesus mythicism standards, you'd have to throw out the premise of games like Ghost of Tsushima, which is loved by millions of historians and casual gamers alike. So let's get interesting. Socrates, the founding father of Western philosophy and frequently misquoted in ironic meme culture. He walked the streets of Athens, challenged the elites, and was executed by the state. Plato and Xenophon wrote down plenty about Socrates, and he is a staple throughout philosophy and history classes alike. Here's one small problem, though. He never actually wrote anything down himself. This is a common knowledge. In fact, his disciples wrote extremely contradictory accounts about him. Aristophanes showed him as a con artist, while Xenophon props him up as someone who had plenty of practical advice. Plato even turns him into a metaphysical genius. Well, who do you believe? In the case of Jesus' mythicism, they'd have to believe none of the above, because they were all devoted to Socrates during that point in their lives, and thus we would be classified as unreliable. They would argue for the contamination bias. The only one who would be considered a bit more trustworthy would be Aristophanes, and that showed Socrates in a completely different light than how the historical record reflects. Taking this route turns him into little more than Plato's fan fiction. Now, for fun, let's quickly look at the archetypal reductionism that we talked about earlier, applied to Jesus in comparison to the other gods with Jesus. So, you see a lot of these little AI generated charts that says like, oh, well, this, that, and the other. Like Jesus was super similar to Horus or super similar to Mithras. No, let's really look at this. Horus, absolutely not born of a virgin. His mother used the body of Osiris to conceive him. Trust me, you don't want to know how. I'm cursed with that information already. On December 25th, that wasn't even a thing yet. December 25th just wasn't a thing. And he wasn't crucified. He was poisoned as an infant, and his mother brought him back to life with magic. You can read about Horus in the Contendings of Horus and Seth to fact check me. Mithras was not born of a virgin. He was literally born out of a rock as a young man, not a baby. And I'd say that's about as far as from the virgin birth as you can get. And was never crucified. He actually doesn't have a death story at all. This is all recreated from iconography left over, as there's really no text we can examine, which is kind of ironic, I know. Osiris, Egyptian god of the dead, he was not raised from the dead for sins. He was the god of the Duat. He was not born of a virgin. He was born to Geb and Nut, and was not crucified. His first death was from being locked in a box, and the second one was from being cut up like a 14-piece chicken meal. You can read about this in Plutarch's Deisdi et Osiride. Jews thought paganism was repugnant unless they apostatized and worshipped that deity themselves. So they would absolutely not invent one using the very scriptures that condemned idol worship. This brush by mythicists is reductionist to Second Temple Judaism. So they would not have made up their own Messiah like this. It wouldn't make any sense. So, despite attempts from those who would misquote secular scholarship and those who swear an AI chart is a fact, Jesus' mythicism is not only shaky, but rocks the boat too much when compared to with what we can glean about history from textual evidence. While yes, Alexander the Great and company left behind coins or cities and not just text for us to examine, it's completely disingenuous to throw out standard textual methodology just to make an exception for Jesus of Nazareth. Even if we did, mythicists would still need to contend with vast archaeological findings, like the Megiddo mosaic, the Alexamenos graffito, or the Sennacherib prism, but we can get into that another day. So, we gotta ask the question, if Jesus walked the earth and is attested to this much, what should we do with that information?